Okay, we're in Romans chapter 12. We started out and we've been here and kind of going back and reviewing and having all of those disruptions that we've had for the past 3 or 4 weeks. It seems like it's been a month really since we've been able to assemble and kind of get down to studying in a regular way. So today we ought to be able to do that. Now we're starting out in Romans chapter 12. We want to remember that the thing that he is talking about here and introduced to us in verses 1 and 2 is that God wants you in your totality. He wants your body and your mind. We normally think, when we getting to think about sacrifices that we make for God, what do we give Him? Our mind goes to our money. Well, we need to give Him money. We need to be liberal in giving Him and in our giving and so forth. But that is not even referred to in here. It's not that. He said, what I want is, I want you, I want your body as a living sacrifice, and I want your mind as one that has been totally transformed and changed from the mind of the world to the mind of Christ. So he introduces this section in this way then. And he uses that word transformed, which we've talked about, taking a worm and turning it into a butterfly. Then we talked about the first step in transforming your mind. The first thing he said that you must do is not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think. Now today we're going to be talking about this from other passages, and we're going to see really what God thinks about a situation like this. You could spend, I guess, hours and hours on reading about this one thing. But Paul here just starts out and he says, now here's the first thing that you need to do. And so it's something that we need to consider and we need to think about. And as we pointed out last week, that if you baptize somebody tomorrow, and when you brought them up out of the waters of baptism, if they said, now, what's the first thing that I should be doing? We would probably say, well, you need to get involved in Bible study. You need to make sure that you attend all the services. You need to. And all of this is true. All this is true. But wouldn't it be probably the right thing to look the person in the eye and say, you need now to not think of yourself more highly than you ought to think. In other words, you probably got a problem. And your problem that you probably have, this is a problem that most people have, is thinking too highly of yourself, more highly than you ought to think. And of course, this would shock a lot of people in this and thinking, oh, I don't do that. But this is what the Bible warns us about over and over and over again is this particular situation here. He tells us then that we are to think soberly. And I want to emphasize again in our review right here that is a word, all of us know what it means. It means thinking clearly. It means the opposite of intoxicated. It means the opposite of having something in your mind that keeps you from thinking clearly. We normally go to alcohol when we think this way, and we say, well, was he intoxicated or was he sober? And we think, did he have too much to drink so he couldn't think clearly? Or was he sober so he could think clearly? But here, what he says is that we need to be able to think soberly. Now, the way Paul uses it then is that the thing that will intoxicate us, the thing that will keep us from thinking clearly, is if we think more highly of ourselves than what we ought to think. If we have that problem, nothing else is going to really fall in line. You're not going to be able to think clearly in that way. It's going to affect every aspect of your life, every relationship you have with anybody else, and you're going to be intoxicated on that thought that is going to keep you from thinking clearly. Then he tells us that we're to think clearly and so to think in this way, so that realizing each one of us has a job. And the interesting thing is that we want to point out here, that when you're thinking clearly, you understand that you're not the answer to the problems of this world. You need to realize that when you die, how much is it going to affect this world? Really, when you stop to think about it, when you die, what will happen to this world? Do you suppose they'll quit fighting in the Middle East like they're fighting now? Do you suppose that the president will declare a holiday, or that Congress will say, we don't know what to do because so-and-so died? In other words, what effect will it have upon the world? And as you look at it, you look and you say, well, it's just a little blip. The only effect it will have is just with my family. And it will certainly have an effect upon them, but that really is all that it's going to have. So we're not the answer to all things to all people. So he shows us certain things then. And he said, now some people have this gift, some people have that. We're not going over them today, but we've already been there. Some people can do this. Now, you find what you can do. You find what your abilities are. Don't think too highly of yourself. Understand two things. You must understand that there are other people. In fact, every other person. Just look around. You look at anybody, the person next to you. That person can do things you cannot do. Think about it that seriously. And you need to say, you think, even so-and-so? Yeah, even so-and-so. That every person you ever see can do things you can't do. They can do it better than you can do it. Now, on the other hand, you have to also understand that there are some things that you can do better than anybody else in this world. And that's what you need to search for. What can I do? What are my abilities? What am I able to do in my service to the Lord? And then I give myself to that and find what it really is. Now, today, we're going to start out now in everyday relationships. If we're going to totally give our mind and our body to Christ, be the kind of person He would have us to be, how do we live in our everyday relationships? Now, this is interesting as we start through here, because you can scan this in your Bible or you can scan it up here, and you see that he just goes bing, 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 from one thing to another. And how many things does he cover, really, in those short verses right there? He could stop and he could take each one, and we'll stop really on each one. He could stop and he could develop that. And if he developed that theme, how long would the book of Romans be? Let love stop. He talks about love then. So if he gave Bible instruction about love, how long would it take him to describe what love really is? Love be without hypocrisy. How long would it take him to talk and tell us about everything he knows about hypocrisy? He says, abhor that which is evil. How long would it take him then to go into the evil things, look at these evil things and say, now here are things that you need to hate. And then you go on, and you go on, and you go on, and you would say, well, if Paul had commented on each one of these things, the book of Romans would probably be longer than the entire New Testament. Now, all I'm trying to do is just to get us to see that this section is a section that is just loaded with instruction. And yet it is a brief section. It is just an outline. But yet it's just loaded with things that we have to do. So if I'm going to totally transform my mind to be like Christ, and I'm going to use my body to be like Christ, then what do I do? So here are the things that he's going to tell us. Let's look at them, kind of take them up here one at a time, and see what he has to say. We'll not prolong each one of them. We'll just kind of go through it very rapidly here again. But let love. Now, when you define the word love, that word really means the attitude that causes one to act in the best interest of whatever it is they love. So love is a disposition. Love is an attitude. Love is something that you have in your mind. It's a motivating factor. It's something that causes you to do certain things. Love is that attitude that causes you to always act in the best interest of whatever you love. If you love your cat, you're going to act in the best interest of your cat. If you love your car, if you love your neighbor, if you love your brethren, if you love God, it means that you've got to look and see, what do I do which is in the best interest of whatever it is that I'm loving? God says, as we're to love God, He makes it pretty simple for us. And you say, well, how do you love God? How do you act in God's best interest? Now, notice right here, we're not talking about just a feeling. We're not talking about a love feeling. We're not talking about a man and a woman falling in love with each other. We're talking about an attitude. Now, God tells us, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. Really, that's what He says 2 or 3 times. So, as you look at that, you say, why did He say that? Well, if you love God, you're going to act in God's best interest. What is the best for God? What should I do today that is not in my best interest necessarily, but what should I do that is in God's best interest? And it just boils down, you keep my commandments. And when we keep the commandments of God, we're always acting in God's best interest. Obviously, we're also acting in our own best interest when we do that. But love. So now then He says, let your love here be without hypocrisy. The word hypocrisy means feigned or disguised. It's the word that the Greek used for movie stars, stage actors. They didn't have movie stars then, so they talked about stage actors. So if you needed somebody to take the role of Cicero or take the role of Caesar, you went and got an actor. And he came in, and what did the actor do? He acted like he's somebody other than himself. He acted like he was Caesar. He presented himself. He dressed up so he looked like Caesar. He would talk like Caesar. He would do things like Caesar did. He would study Caesar. And finally, there are some actors that can get this down to just almost perfection. And you say, well, I really can't tell the difference in the real thing and the stage actor. Well, that guy was called a hypocrite. He was a stage actor. And the closer he got to the real thing, the better actor he was. That's still the same today. Now today, since we don't speak Greek, we use this word, and it was used in Bible times, as a derogatory term. The Bible uses hypocrisy. Jesus uses, especially in Matthew 23, over and over again about the hypocrites. Don't be as a hypocrite. Now, the whole point was, don't you take yourself, a person who is really not a good person. You're really not serving God. But you put on a front and you act like you're serving God. And you learn those things that you ought to say under certain circumstances. And then you say those things. You learn how you ought to act if you're really a good Christian. And then you act that way. And so you act that way, you're a hypocrite when you're really not that way. I was telling Steve the other day, First time I ever came to this in my life was with my dad. And it was quite an impact on me because I was just a young boy, I don't know, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. But anyway, my dad worked in the oil field, which is a rough situation. But in the oil field out there, he had his foreman, the boss, was an elder in the church. And I'd see this guy every Sunday. He was always dressed up immaculate. His language was impeccable. You looked at him and it was almost like looking at the Apostle Paul himself, the impression that you would have. Now, my dad was an alcoholic. And he'd go 6 months without alcohol and 6 months with alcohol. The 6 months with alcohol, he was mean. He was really mean. And he quit going to church. The 6 months without it, he'd go back to church. He'd repent of his sins, go back, and I'm going to do better. But then, without it, then I remember him explaining to us kids in the family. We were saying, Dad, why don't you go to church? And he'd say, I am as good as or better than those hypocrites. And he'd say, if you were out on the job and you heard what this man says, how he cusses, how he does these ungodly things, I'm a better man than he is. I'm a better man than the hypocrites that are down there. Well, blew my mind. Couldn't understand how this man could look so good on Sunday. And my dad would say this in his drunken times. And so I never really believed that this guy was this way. So my brother, 6 years older than I am, he grew up. He went to work in the oil field. He came back with the same thing. You can't believe how he talks. And so you start getting the information, and then you'd say, wow. So whenever I think about a hypocrite, I think about, wow. As I stand before you today, honestly, deep in my heart, it's hard for me to say, I believe my dad was telling the truth. Well, I take what he and my brother says or what I saw. And if they are, you have a hypocrite that just blows your mind. Now, are any of us that way? What do we do out on the job tomorrow? Is there cussing? Is there laughing at filthy jokes? Is there doing things that the Bible would not condone that you do? Is there cheating? What is going on out there? Oh, I know how we look today. We all have on our suits and ties, and we all greet one another and grin, and there won't be any cussing. There won't be any filthy language in the building today. None at all. Won't be any drinking here. Won't be any swearing. Won't be any filthy jokes. I understand all that. But will there be tomorrow? So tomorrow, if there is, and you have anything in your life, you stop to think, you know, what I'm doing right now is exactly the opposite of what Paul says. I am a hypocrite. I am not giving my body and my mind to Jesus Christ. See, Paul's talking about serious things. Talking about serious things with people here. All right, then he says, abhor that which is evil, cleave to that which is good. Now the word abhor means dislike, abhor, or have horror of. That's kind of an interesting term, and it's kind of a scary term. If I were to ask you, everybody take out a pencil and paper, and I'm going to give you a test. And I want you to write down 3 things that you are really frightened of, that you just really dislike, you hate, that you have horror of. Well, most of us would probably put down snake. Then we might put down something else that would happen to us. But how many of us would start out with evil? with the evil things that are around about us. This is what I hate. I hate lying. I have a horror of it. I have a horror of it more than I have a horror of snakes. How many of us would start putting down evil things in our lives? That's what Paul's talking about. He said, abhor in here, dislike things that are evil. Let's look at some passages. In Psalms, the psalmist said, I hate and abhor falsehood, but thy law do I love. Now think about this. Here it is, he makes it plain of what he just hates. He just abhors it. That's the point I want us to see. I suppose there's different degrees of hate. Like there's different degrees of love and different degrees of everything. Some things I don't like very much, but put up with. There are other things I just absolutely detest. So what he says is here, I hate and abhor. Just totally hate. And what is it you totally hate? Falsehood. That which is not true. Now when you look at falsehood, how big a word is that? Well, the opposite would be truthhood, wouldn't it? Now when you put the word hood on a word in English, what do you mean? Brotherhood. The brotherhood. What does hood do? Well, it just rounds up all the things you're talking about, in this case, the brothers in Christ, rounds them all up and looks at them as one group. Now, what is falsehood? Falsehood is everything that is not true. And you just round up everything that is not true, put it in one bucket. That's falsehood. Whether it's something, it's lying that somebody says, or in this case, it's kind of interesting. Look at what he uses just opposite. But thy law do I love. Now, when you start with that word but, you say something. But. The but now is going to give you just the opposite view. Now here it is, I hate falsehood. But on the other side of falsehood, I love thy law. Paul here, or the psalmist here, is talking about false doctrines. Anything that's false, anything that is opposed to the law of God. If it's opposed to the law of God, I hate it, is what he says. Now, stop and think about this a minute. Maybe it's something, especially in our culture, that we ought to develop a little bit more. Maybe we ought to become better haters. Doesn't that sound funny? If you'd say, okay, I'm going to start a series of lessons on hate. And I want to try to, we're going to have a new class here on Tuesday night. And I want to try to talk about not anger management, not something of this nature, but I want to try to teach you how to really hate good. I want it so that when you walk out these doors in 8 weeks, you can say, I am a hater. Wouldn't that sound funny? But that's what he says. I hate every falsehood. Now, couldn't it be this? When we take the truth of God, let's take what he says about his church. And we'll not go into it today. You know what I'm talking about. There's one church. Here's what you do. Now, that's the truth. Now, as you come over here, every doctrine that is not agreeable with this law, every doctrine about the church that is different than this, what should we do with it? We should hate it. We should hate it. How many doctrines are there out there that are taught that are not in agreement with this? What do? A whole lot of times we flirt around with them. Well, this is not too bad. This is awful close. This is something that, it's not. What does this say? I hate every falsehood, but I love the Word of God, see? I love the law of God. So it's hating false doctrine. That's something we need to build up, something we need to understand. When this comes to my mind, there's one guy that always comes to my mind, that's Al Bass. How many here remember Al Bass? He's been dead now for several years. He was a preacher down at Issaquah. If there's ever a man that hated denominational doctrines and falsehood, it was Al Bass. He just absolutely hated and despised it. Well, I remember one of the first lessons, it may have been the first lesson, after I moved up here that I ever heard him preach. What I ever heard him preach. He was an artist, didn't have overheads, so he had a bed sheet, and he had drawn up his sermon on a bed sheet. And the title of his sermon is, If You Love the Roses, You Have to Hate the Weeds. That was the title. And I looked up there, and if you love the roses, you have to hate the weeds. And of course, his sermon was very clear, and that is that if you're giving your life to the roses, and you're doing everything you can do to grow roses, what do you do to all of the weeds and all the things around that grow up that try to choke them out? Anything that takes the fertilizer away from your roses, what do you do to it? Anything that's out there that drinks up the water that your roses need in the rain, what do you do to it? You go out and you rip up the weeds. And if you're coming by, somebody comes by, and they see you down in your rose garden on your knees, and you're ripping up weeds, right? Throwing them away, ripping up all of this vegetation. And they say, what are you doing? You could answer in two ways. You could say, well, I'm weeding, I'm ripping up weeds. Or you could say, oh, I'm loving my rose garden. I'm showing love to my rose garden. That was his sermon. Very excellent sermon that he had. So now, hate. That's what we got. He said, through thy precepts I get understanding, therefore I hate every false way. So he said, now it's through your precepts, God, your law, that's where I get my understanding. So as a result, I hate every false way. Every way that's false, I hate it. Then he says, the fear of Jehovah is to hate evil. Now, oh boy, where do you start and where do you end? The psalmist talks about, the proverbist, that the beginning of knowledge, the beginning of wisdom, is to fear Jehovah. That is the beginning of it, of this wisdom. Now up here he says, the fear of Jehovah is to hate evil. So if you really fear Jehovah, is there a negative aspect to it? It means that you always act in His best interest, but what do you do to evil? You abhor it. You don't have any association with it. You get away from it. So he said, I hate evil, pride, and arrogancy, and the evil way, and the perverse mouth. So I said, now here's some things I just hate. I just hate them. Pride. When you see somebody that shows off his pride. Now you see, here's a problem. Now haughty, the next one there, and arrogancy is something where it shows off. But could I be proud of myself and not show it off in a haughty way? And have you ever heard of anybody who it's said about them that their greatest virtue is how humble they are? In other words, I'm so proud of myself. There was one time it was said, I don't know whether this is true or not. It doesn't sound like it could be. But one guy asked another guy who was a preacher, and in the church is the way this thing went. And very powerful man, very wonderful man, excellent speaker about 75, 80 years ago. And he went to him and asked him, he said, what makes you such a great man? I want to learn after you. What makes you such a great man? And he said, he thought for just a minute. He said, well, I think my greatest virtue is my humility. Well, what does that tell you right there? What does that tell you? All of the humbleness he had, of where he had the ability to show humbleness, if this is true. He had cultivated that so that everybody would look at him and think, oh, how humble I am. How sweet and how humble I am. It was because of his great pride. Well, arrogancy, that's the other side. That's where we show it. That's where we prance around and, yeah, I've got this pride and I'm showing it. And the evil way and the perverse mouth. The perverse mouth is the one that doesn't tell the truth. You can't really believe what is coming out of it. So he's telling us now, these are things that we need to learn and put in our life. The clock back there just told me that it's 10:35 and it's time to shut up. So class dismissed today.